Hey friends, welcome to the Purple Zone, where public policy, practice, and people meet. Because policy isn't abstract, it's personal. So let's talk about it. Hey friends, welcome to the show. It's Alexis, and today I'm coming at you with a topic that it's permeating the state. I see a lot of articles about it, and that is special education and the special education funding gap that that is very real in Idaho. And so today, though, with special education, I'm going to start with something personal. Two stories, not statistics, not policy language, just some lived moments that shaped how I understand special education and why this conversation really matters so much right now. So the first story takes place when my daughter, who is now 19, she was just in kindergarten. We were living in New Hampshire. My husband was getting some medical training stuff along the way. We lived in several places in the States before we came back to Idaho. So we're in New Hampshire. We're at this little elementary school. And at our elementary school, there were two adults in every classroom at this elementary school. There was the teacher and the paraprofessional. And it was a great classroom. There was like roughly 18 to 20-ish kids. And my daughter loved it. It was wonderful. And a parent came to me and she was shocked from something that she had heard from her daughter. And she asked me if my daughter had come home and told the story, and I said no. And I almost kind of felt like, oh, is your daughter over exaggerating? Because I didn't hear anything from my kid. And so I go and I ask my little kindergartner, hey, did this thing happen in class today? Like, did this one kid get so mad that he threw a chair across the classroom and the class had to be ushered out of the room? And my daughter, in her sweet little voice, said, yes, that happened. And I went, whoa, okay. So, gosh, did that bother you at all? And she just, again, in her sweet little voice said, no, that boy, he was just having a hard time. And that moment, just has stayed with me, not because of the behavior itself, but because of what made it, what made my daughter's feeling okay and how the staff were able to respond to that incident, in part because there were two teachers, and they in the classroom. There were enough adults. There was support, and because of that, a 6-year-old little girl could see that her classmate was not a threat. But as someone who was just having a hard day, and through the eyes of a 6-year-old, I saw what compassion looks like when support is actually in place. Second story, we're in Lewiston, and that's where all four of my kids did a majority of their elementary years. And Lewiston is just 5 hours north of Boise. And this is now, my son is in third grade, and he has this remarkable teacher. And she had been a special education teacher prior to becoming a third grade teacher. And so there were these two brothers in third grade, and they were twin brothers, obviously, and one of them has autism. And up until that point, the brothers had been in the same class together, but not that year. And so the one with autism was in my son's classroom. And the other twin brother in the other classroom, was very cognizant of his brother, and he wanted to make sure that his brother was taken care of. And it was really sweet to watch these two brothers interact. And so my son's in the classroom with a boy with autism, and this boy is nonverbal, essentially. And there was this intentional moment of inclusion. Now, I am I am very comfortable with the word inclusion. It's the opposite of inclusion. Inclusivity is exclusivity, and I don't think that being exclusive, intentionally exclusive, is good for relationships. I don't think it's good for families. I don't think it's good for communities. Certainly not good in school settings. And so I'm not afraid of the word inclusion, and I'm going to use it because in this moment, it is so applicable. So this third grade teacher would have a special education paraprofessional bring the twin brother with autism to the classroom, to the general education classroom. And the teacher would have two students go out, either outside when the weather was good or in the gym. And those two students with the paraprofessional would learn how to interact with the twin with autism. And in that experience, I'll never forget the day my son came home and I asked him, "Oh, how was your day?" And like, what did you do? And all these different things. And he had said, "Oh, this is what we did with," and, said his name. And he started explaining it to me. And I thought, my son was learning how to interact with someone, not just that someone was different. And what these kids learned from that third grade teacher and from the paraprofessional was how to treat others with dignity, a sense of community, and a sense of belonging. And and the kids in those classrooms, when they would have those experiences, that intentional pull out to learn how to play and interact with this boy with autism, they learn it was far more than just learning reading and math that day, which they did. They were doing reading and they were learning math, but they also learned empathy. They learned dignity, and they learned that every student belongs. And that did not happen by accident. It happened because adults had the time, the training, and the support to make inclusion real. And these weren't just good teaching moments, they were moments made possible by support, staffing, and partnership. Now, I wanted to do this episode because I keep hearing a similar question, idea from parents, from teachers, and from lawmakers, which is centered around this. Families are often the ones absorbing the impact of funding gaps. What does that actually look like? And that's why I wanted to do this episode, because right now, too many classrooms do not have the level of support that is needed. And when support falls short, the impact shows up everywhere. So, what are we seeing right now? By law, when it comes to special education, I just want to walk through a little bit of language with you so you understand exactly what I'm talking about. When we're talking about special education and kids who are within this special education category, these students by law are to be placed in a classroom in the least restrictive environment. And the least restrictive environment, that means students should learn with their peers as much as possible with the supports they need, not be separated because the system cannot provide them. So, in special education, students are to be placed in the least restrictive environment, which is often short for LRE. Okay, I keep saying that because I want to make sure that you're able to kind of capture this. So, a student with disability should learn with their non-disabled peers as much as possible with supports, and should only be separated from general education when it's truly necessary for them to learn and be safe. So, least restrictive environment does not mean every student must be in general education all day. Least restrictive environment does not mean supports should be removed. And least restrictive environment does not mean inclusion at all costs. Restrictive, that word restrictive, describes how separated a student is from typical peers not how intense their needs are. So, from least restrictive to most restrictive, placements can look like this. The least restrictive would be general and a general education class with supports. The second would be general education plus push in services like a paraprofessional, therapist, a co teacher. A third would be general education plus pull out services for part of the day. A fourth would be separate special education classroom, and a fifth would be a separate school or specialized program. And that's just kind of giving you an idea of what that could look like. Within special education, there are students that have an IEP. This is an individualized education program. I would have to have a whole other entire episode on that, so I'm not going to dive into it. But it's just to point out that based on what I've been sharing with you regarding, least restrictive to most restrictive, that's very individualized for the student. And the goal is always to stay as far up on that list as possible, as close to general education classrooms with support as possible, as long as the student can make meaningful progress. So it's about the student and what the student needs. So the essentially, the schools, they're kind of when they're going and they're asking themselves questions. And listen, I've never sat in on an IEP. But essentially, it's my understanding, the schools must ask, can the student be educated in general education with appropriate supports? And if not, what is the minimum level of separation needed for the student to learn? So, that's essentially questions that are being asked as they're developing that IEP and what is best for the student. So, appropriate supports, that includes paraprofessionals, behavioral supports, accommodations, modifications, assistive technology. And if those supports are not provided, a placement decision is not truly least restrictive environment, even if the student is physically in the room. We want to make sure that those supports are in place for them. So here's the part I think that gets misunderstood or causes some conflict. Least restrictive environment is not about what is easiest for the system. It's about what works for the individual child. So, common misuses of the phrase least restrictive environment you might hear are, quote, they can't be in gen ed because we don't have the staff. No, that's not what least restrictive environment means. Another misuse, inclusion is not working when supports were never provided. Nope, that's not meeting the needs of the student. And, or the phrase, well, that's just how the district does it. Nope, that's not least restrictive environment. That would be a phrase that would be the easiest for the system. So those are resource explanations. Gosh, we might do this a little bit differently. Those are resource explanations. Those are not least restrictive environment justifications. Those are not justifications. So, how does this connect to the broader topic here? So, when funding falls short, and I want to dive into this because this issue, this lack of funding issue impacts all people within that school. So when funding falls short, their schools are going to lack para support. Students are going to get moved to more restrictive settings. Families are going to feel blamed, and kids lose access to their peers. So, when you hear least restrictive environment, what it really means is this: inclusion first, separation only when necessary, and only after supports are tried. That, in essence, is what it means. So, when students' needs go unmet, here's what shows up in the classroom: escalating behavior, maybe some safety concerns, disrupted learning for all students, larger class sizes, and students in special education who could be in general education classrooms if adequate para support were available. And for students, when the correct support is not needed or is not available, Students internalize failure. Um, there is anxiety and disengagement, and often students can feel like they're the problem instead of a learner. And students, it has broken my heart to hear that from some parents and students. And I just think, oh, that's not what we want for our Idaho kids. We can do better. When funding support is not available, and it's not met on that fiduciary responsibility level by the state and the feds, for educators, this looks like burnout because of immense over workload, chronic stress, emotional exhaustion, and high turnover and retention challenges. So this one thing that as I've spoken with teachers, and I think it's so important to relay, is that um, this isn't happening. Teachers are not experiencing burnout and chronic stress and emotional exhaustion and high turnover because they don't care. That's not true. It connects with the system is asking them to do more than the system is currently supporting. So, like, when I zoom out, it becomes clear that these challenges are not isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a system under strain, and that strain has a very real source. There's a source for where this strain that's being placed on schools and principals and teachers and students and parents is coming from. And this is where the $100 million gap comes into place. So that number did not get pulled out of thin air. It comes from the Idaho Office of Performance Evaluations. That acronym is OPE, and you'll see that in different articles. You'll hear people talking about it. OPE. The Idaho Office of Performance Evaluations is an independent, nonpartisan, and it works for the legislature. It doesn't work for anyone else. It works for the legislature. And OPE compared real costs the districts incur versus what the state reimburses. And these were the key findings. One, Idaho only reimburses about 2/3 of the actual SPED costs. And that now adds up to 90 to $110 million annually. Last year, Idaho was short 82.2 million, and now it's closer to 100 million in that 90 to $110 million range. To clarify, special education is not optional. It is a legal requirement from the federal government. And the feds, I just recently learned that the feds are required to pay 40%, and they're not meeting that either. So when we talk about a $100 million gap, we're not talking about a hypothetical problem. We're talking about real, reoccurring shortfalls that districts are legally required to solve, whether the funding is there or not. And that then, when the funding is not there and the districts are still required to meet those expectations and they are not being given the support from the state and the feds, the district has to make that up locally. And there is a myth that the shortfall gap of special education only impacts special education kids. That is one of the biggest misunderstandings, is that it only impacts SPED kids when SPED funding is short. And that is not true. So when state and federal dollars fall short, districts must pull from the general fund. And this means that locals, in part, really make up what the state doesn't pay. And that same fund that the district is pulling from supports general education teachers, class sizes, electives, counseling, mental health supports for all students, not just special education students. So it is not accurate to say that SPED money takes away money from other kids. It is accurate to say that underfunded mandates force districts to stretch local dollars across all students. And once once you understand that special education is funded this way, it becomes clear why the impact spreads far beyond any one group of students. Now, there is, and this is kind of where the question comes from, the burden and the strain that is put on families. I was just on a panel the other day for special education, and I was asked to give my perspective. I was asked to give the parent perspective. And I took this from stories that I've heard from parents around the state, from some of my own experiences, and from some of my family members. What does this strain on families look like when the state does not meet its fiduciary responsibility? So, families have varying capacity to address challenges that they face, particularly challenges from the government. And this is where the families have these varying capacities. So some families have a higher capacity. They have more of an ability to deal with this strain, this burden, and other families have less of a capacity. Now, this is where inequity shows up. And okay, here's another word that I am not afraid of and that I think has value in it. There is real applicable use here. So I'm going to give you an example of inequity and how inequity is used to help everyone get on the same page. So imagine that, Alexis, that's me. Imagine that I am standing in front of a 6-foot fence. And no, excuse me. I am standing in front of a 6-foot 5-inch fence. 6 foot 5 inches. I am only 5'4". So I am not going to be able to see over the fence. I cannot see what's happening on the other side of the fence. I'm 5'4". And then Governor Little stands next to me. And Governor Little, I looked it up, he's 6 foot. So Governor Little cannot see over the fence either. He cannot see what's happening on the other side of the fence. And now imagine that Shaquille O'Neal, Shaq, an incredible basketball player I grew up watching, he is 7'1". He can see over that fence. So we're at three different spots here. 6 foot 5-inch fence. Shaq can see over it. Governor Little cannot see over it, and I cannot see over it. Now, if that problem were to be addressed equally, and everyone was given an equal stool, so I'm given a stool that's going to get my 5'4" self to that 6'5" overlook, that height of a stool, if that height of a stool is given to Governor Little and is given to Shaq, well, first of all, Shaq's going to now be falling over that fence, but that's what equal looks like. Equity would say we need to give Alexis that stool that's going to help her see over that. She needs the most amount of help to see over it. Governor Little, he only needs 5 inches. So we're just going to give him a 5-foot-inch stool. And Shaq doesn't need any help. He's not going to he can see over that fence himself. So that's the visual of equity, giving people what they need to make it so that we're all on this level playing field. And so that's what I'm talking about when families have varying capacity to deal with the burdens that are placed on them when the state does not meet their financial responsibility. That's where inequity shows up for the families, and that's then how it trickles down to kids. So when as the state doesn't meet these things, their financial responsibilities, and as families are addressing the challenges that come from navigating the system, the burden shows up in having to have constant advocacy to speak up for your kid and to navigate the education system, having to attend meetings during work hours, understanding legal jargon so you can fully articulate and understand what's going on, seeking outside services and resources. That could mean that you pay out of pocket for therapies, and because the school isn't able to maybe provide some things for your kid, now families maybe need to go get tutors, and sometimes it also means leaving the system altogether. And schools cannot control this piece. Schools cannot control what a family's capacity is to navigate that burden. Um, and like I said, families come into this system with very different capacities to navigate it. Some can advocate confidently. Others go, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Some families can take time off work when they have to make several meetings. Other families cannot like taking time off work means really can mean financial negative implications for their family. Some families can pay for tutors or therapy. Some families can move schools because mom or dad can drive them to a new school or they've got a grandparent close by, and others cannot. So that difference is not about love or effort. It's about capacity. And that's where this uneven impact shows up. And that's something that I think is so important to note, that all families love their kids and all families want to give that effort for their kid, but families have that different capacity to do so. So, um, essentially, in some measure, families don't choose how much capacity they bring into the system. Life has happened, all these different things occur, everyone's made different choices. Families show up with what they have. And when the system is hard to navigate, those differences matter. Now, I want to share with you what can lessen the burden that families feel. And this is a thing that schools can control, and that is partnership. Schools don't control whether the state and federal government fully funds special education, but schools do control how they work with families. Now, what does that look like? That looks like listening to families, explaining really thoroughly the different components to families. And it's am I talking with families or am I talking about families? And uh, it looks like communicating really clearly with those parents. And partnering looks like treating children and parents with dignity. And when partnership is strong, families feel like they're on the same team with the school. The burden feels shared, it does not feel personal. And when those partnerships are strong, the families understanding can realize that the district is doing what it can and the family needs to do what it can, and it's the state that's not meeting its financial responsibility. It's not the district is not causing the problem. And to me, this is where hope lives for me, that because even when funding is tight, partnership can change how that burden feels. That's I just, it is kind of, sometimes I feel like a broken record when I talk about school family partnerships. That is such a key in so many of the things that we do. And it is key in with this sped problem that the state has with funding. So, okay, so what would fully funding change if special education, behavioral supports, and mental health staffing were fully and reliably funded for students? This would look like more inclusion in general education settings, fewer behavioral crises, safer, calmer classrooms, and early intervention instead of these emergency responses. For educators and for staff, it would mean more manageable caseloads, improved teacher retention, less burnout, and more time teaching instead of crisis management. And for families, that could look like feeling as though they're on the same team as the school. And the burden families carry would be significantly eased, and trust would be built, not eroded. And most importantly than ever, more positive stories would be shared. There are incredible things happening around the state, and as schools work to really partner with parents and parents work to partner with schools, we have more that's when trust building occurs, and that's where we have these more positive experiences and we can share these positive experiences with others. So when funding is stable and partnerships are strong, the story of special education shifts from constant strain to shared success. Um, it means that we have these strong connections between families and schools, and it starts to feel more like a shared commitment instead of this disjointed experience where the family is frustrated because of teachers and administrators or the district not doing, and then the state, and it feels like this disjointed uh, things all over the place. And so this is why partnership matters so much. And this is why funding matters so much, because we can come together and it's a much more fluid, better experience for our kids. Now, why is this urgent? For educators and for lawmakers, this is not a someday issue. This is a today issue because the special education population is now 12 to 15%, not 6%. And there was a great conversation on the Ranch podcast back in, I think, September or late August with the superintendent of the Fruitland School District describing what, from his perspective, it is like to be a district leader and just describing navigating this special education lack of funding space. This is urgent because districts have vacancies they cannot fill. There are so many vacancies with districts around the state they can't fill. And I just heard a school board member talk about the challenges of, hey, we have all these positions open for special education. We need paraprofessionals and we can't hire them. And part of that challenge is that paraprofessionals are paid less than fast food wages. Paraprofessionals are paid less than fast food wages. That is significant. That is unfortunate because these paraprofessionals are with our children and they are helping our kids learn and navigate their school day, and they are a valued part of the school community. And it's true. One way that we show that we value people is by paying them what they deserve. So, and golly, no one's asking for gobs of money, but I saw what the annual wage for a paraprofessional was on a piece of paper last night at an event. And dare I say that I think I saw that it was less than $30,000 a year. Um, so if I'm wrong on that, feel free to correct me, but that's what I'm pretty sure I saw on that page. And I about fell off my seat. This is a today issue because kids are watching and future educators are listening. And how we as adults address this challenge, address the situation that we are in, is impacting these little people in our lives. And they are our future. And it would be so fantastic if we treated them as though we valued our future and their future. And we made decisions based on that. So, I want to acknowledge something plainly, and this is a hard truth. And for me, it comes with a hope. Some families have terrible experiences in special education. That is real, and it is not acceptable. Humans are flawed, and also some district employees are propping up a way of doing things within their district that is not helpful for kids and is the opposite of partnering with parents. And that needs to stop. Most of the negative stories I hear could be improved, not with more rules, but with stronger partnerships, both within the district, the employees, the principals, paras, and other staff, and with parents. Parents are the number one influence on their children. They must be at the table, and parents must be treated with dignity while they are there. And that is coming from a place of just sincere honesty from family experiences. I would be remiss if I didn't say it over the microphone that these negative stories could be immensely improved if the district worked to treat parents and students with dignity. And and when those things happen, this is the thing that's so hard, is that I feel like I live between this space of wanting to make sure that that people understand and value our public entities. They're important. They're what help keep our communities going. And these policies that happen in real life practice impact real people. And there are some incredible things happening all over my community, my district, our state. And there are also some stories that are terrible. And unfortunately, sometimes it feels like those terrible stories just end up louder than the beautiful, great stories. And the terrible stories, or that really crummy sped person that a family interacted with, tarnishes the good name of all the incredible sped teachers out there. And that is what is sad. I have friends who are incredible special education teachers. Um, and I hear about incredible stories of special education. And those two stories at the beginning of my podcast are uh, educators who are there, who care, and who have the supports in place to make sure that all of the needs of the students are met. Now, before I close, I want to be clear about a couple of things. And if you don't walk away from this episode with anything, I hope you walk away with these 5 brief things. 1, underfunding special education impacts every student, not just SPED students. 2, funding gaps increase the burden and strain on families and educators. 3, a family's capacity to navigate the system determines how hard families are hit. 4, partnership can reduce the burden and strain right now. And 5, we need more voices, not just the loudest ones who are giving these one-off experiences. We need more voices shared so that we can hear the good and we can know how to improve where it's not good. So, every dollar we invest in educating young people pays dividends back to our communities. Our kids are watching what we value. They're doing that through the budgets that the state legislature approves. They're watching us through our words and how we interact with each other, and they're watching us through our actions. Special education is not a side issue. I think it's a measure of who we are as Idahoans and who our policymakers are as individuals. And how we address this shows what we value. Thank you so much for joining today. And I'll just end with, policy is not abstract, it's personal. And when support falls short in these areas, like in education and for our kids, families and educators, we all feel it. Thanks so much. And that's a wrap for today's episode of The Purple Zone. Thanks for being here. If you liked what you heard, leave a review on your fave podcast app or on YouTube. And from me to you, the heart of The Purple Zone says community is where policy comes to life.